That's good. I actually made a task for a task agency to grab my Hormozi playbooks out of my drive and copy them over to our agent deployment team shared drive. Because after comparing your Hormozi folder with mine, I had a lot of other of his books and playbooks in there. So,
Okay, good. Well, if you would, when you're done with that, let's make sure whatever version I have is revised. And I mean, ideally, we're we're sharing a single source of truth.
so you know that Alex Hormozi video where he's talking about the conversation he had with MrBeast about live streamers? Here, let me share it.
Is this something that?
This is one you
Yep.
shared with me originally, but it's been a couple weeks now. I just want to replay this. This is where he's talking about doing lots of live streams.
Yeah. 2026 is the year of live streaming. I remember that. Yep.
I had a conversation with MrBeast a few weeks ago, and we were talking about kind of like the future of media and content. One of the things that he was talking about was the soccer game that came up, that they do like UK versus US. What ends up happening is that they have all these different celebrities or influencers from different platforms. They would walk out in the stadium, and this became the de facto like measuring stick for.
So I looked into this and was like asking AI, like, all right, why does Alex Hormozi think and MrBeast think that live streaming is where it's at, and why at the soccer game are all those folks clapping and cheering louder for the live streamers than the TikTokers and the podcasters who are have just as many followers. You take into account follower count and views, it's the same, but they louder cheer. Why is that? And we kind of dived into this rabbit hole. I'll pull on this thread of parasocial bonding. And like the idea being that they're posting so much more volume and they have sort of, as a viewer, you've got a shared experience with other viewers watching the same thing at the same time, commenting live and getting a reaction from the streamer. And that basically their, parasocial bonding relationship was an order of magnitude stronger with their audience. And this is something that I'm familiar with because I've worked around in media and looked at stuff like this, and like folks like Taylor Swift have a really strong sort of fan base, and her fans often resemble strong traits of having this sort of parasocial relationship where it's just a one-way relationship where they feel like someone is their best friend, but that person doesn't know you, right? And you can even get that way with YouTubers, musicians, comedians. Listen to Joe Rogan every week. Wow, that's really great. Love this guy. It's just like I can almost predict everything he's going to say. I listen to him so much. This is awesome. And it's like he doesn't know who I am, and so that is a parasocial bonding relationship. And it was a pretty interesting thread to pull, and I put it all together into a doc and cleaned it up, and it's on our meeting agenda, I think, as an IDS item, because we had talked about live streaming and what were the options for live streaming. And, it's pretty interesting, but no one is actually live streaming business content, meaning like actually just working. You get folks like Hormozi who will live stream and answer questions and talk about business, but you don't get people who just log on to their job and work, show up to meetings, answer
Twitch style.
messages. Yeah, exactly. Twitch style, just like gamers show up. They ask their chat if they should order Chipotle. Like that's pretty interesting, and I wonder if it's a good reason why no one has done that.
And yeah, well, that's going to be on our one-on-one agenda, not today's podcast. Is that right?
It's on the agenda for Friday.
Okay, cool. Somewhat adjacent to that, I've previously listened to the YouTube formula, the one that the
Mr.
analytics guy that Beast works with. Yeah, played some of it again here just over the holiday, and I was thinking that this needs to be like one of these critiquing agents, right? We could take that book, extract as much of the core concepts as we can, right? I mean, try to see if we can't get the source documents, kind of like we've done with we've taken thousands of pages of Hormozi's and aggregate them as playbooks and use it as a critiquing agent. But take that as a critiquing agent for our media team that does YouTube, and have a regular critique around what are we doing versus the critiquing agent. And as a reads here's stuff, it's like, okay, yeah, sure, but what's the forcing function to ensure that these things are happening, to ensure that we're looking at that we're following the algorithm, that we're using analytics in the way that he's describing, because I mean these are honestly, a lot of what he's describing is very analogous to how I viewed e-commerce over the years. Is this like this? You have to be analytics driven, and so and he has many other concepts in the book. But either way, so critiquing agent for that. Would love to see that happen. It seems like that would be something that as we roll out this critiquing agent concept, that becomes something that team should be able to do following our process, right? It's not like, well, we need to go do it for them.
Right.
Now you might be involved in that. Maybe that's part of the showing them how to do it, and maybe that's an example. But anyway, just wanted to make sure that was said out loud so that it's not just in my head.
No, yeah, I got that. Well, my notepad here. So we're live right now. We're recording, and we have been for the last 10 minutes. And you're getting to walk and whatever. Because I'm basically thinking, taking that live idea of like what it would be for you and I to have our second meeting of the week on a Saturday morning, and keep it still could go through agenda items and whatnot as we're building out these agents. And then we could have the freedom to have, video editors, the folks in the media team cut out stuff that we don't want on there. And then we could have the potential to sit here and have our normal, sometimes we could go 2 hours long. That does happen. And then it gets cut down to, 45 minutes or an hour. I think that could be interesting. But either way, I think you and I, for the first couple minutes here, should open source our conversation around what we think the podcast should look like. And whether we should have other folks on, how soon we should have them on, how long the podcast should be, and sort of...
Which podcast refer to this one, the open source, or the Framework Friday one?
Open source, this one, yeah. And try to figure out the best way to get the most out of this. Some of the pros of doing this podcast are, one, getting more reps in front of camera. I think is important and useful for you. It's useful for me. It could be useful for other folks who are in content, and so that's one utility. The second one is a sort of could be the testing grounds for doing some sort of live streaming or mimicking of streaming, not literally streaming, but just like hopping on a Riverside call here for an hour and a half or whatever it is. That would normally be a one-on-one meeting or a co-working session on building an agent or something, and having that be like a special episode or the normal episode on Saturday. I mean, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, well, this is a little bit maybe just contextually from what I've been working on, but I think it's going to be really important that this is a strategy, right? So kind of going through the heuristic and processes that we've been outlining when it comes to strategy. It's like, well, yeah, which at its core means the human, us in this instance, needs to be aligned with an AI that is helping carry the cognitive load of strategy. Not because we want to listen to the AI, but because as we context switch into many other things, it will help carry the posterity of thinking forward. And then we need to have critiquing agents that are sub agents of that agent that then critique the thought. So as we evolve and define our podcast strategy, it's like, well, where does the documentation about, say, our organization and all this, like, well, we already have that stuff defined, making sure our strategy agent is in sync with that, and then making sure we're using critiquing agents to evolve it. So yeah, I certainly can have some thoughts, but how I feel about believability, meaning I've not done this multiple times successfully. So my kind of predisposed disposition is I want to have believable critiques applied, and it's not just me taking my subjective opinion just because I'd rather accelerate my learning curve. And no doubt we'll learn. I just don't want it to be over the course of 18 months of doing a podcast, like we learned stuff that we could have taken right out of some thought leaders' books, like whoever the book I'm referring to. What's the name of that book? I might as well call it out here. I have it in my Audible right here. This is The YouTube Formula by, I got the script. This is by Daryl Eves, right? Like, that's an ideal critiquing agent that plays, could give us, its thoughts around what our strategy is.
I mean, so we could even, how do you kick off the process with the strategy agent, right? You've got to go to at least with some sort of context about where you are or what you're doing, right? And that could be this transcript from this podcast. It could be, a few paragraph prompt of, we've been doing this podcast for 3 weeks. This is a brand book or like an overview that, Braden originally made a couple weeks ago as just, it's potentially directionally right. But you probably just want to, give it the ground truth of where we are right now? Or do you want to inject it with your thoughts on, I'm leaning this way, or I'd like to do this, or does that mess up the agent?
Is the question how to build a strategy agent, or if one's already built, how to use it?
Yeah, how to use it. It's already built, yeah.
Yeah, if it's already built, right? Because building, it's a whole different beast, and that's what we've been working through. But once it's already built, sure, then you literally just start doing kind of mind dump to it, and the strategy agent already has structure, logical structures in its in the frameworks that it uses, and it's filling in that information, and then it will go through and starts saying, hey, let's kick this over to these critiquing agents and continue to revise the strategy. In fact, this strategy agent, as we've designed it, has triggers to say, when should I involve a critiquing agent, right? So if you're going to get to the core architecture of your strategy, for example, like especially if it's changing, then let's bring in a critiquing agent. And we've talked before about if something's going to change, well, why does it change? You don't just change because you have you woke up this morning, you have a new thought. It's like, well, did a fact on the ground change? Did the landscape change? Did your beliefs change? And those things need to trigger some ideally a critique from a believable source to really help you stress test the thinking there. And the other critiquing agent we have is like our logical critiquing agent, which we've really enjoyed using, right? Which just helps identify like what's the core thesis here, what are the premises you're making, what are the counter arguments, and which helps you identify the blind spots and really helps you flesh out the logic so that you're not just wake up one morning and say, man, I read a book last night, I want to change strategy. And it's like, well, have you really logically broke this down to kind of a first principled approach to the logic? So, and again, I'm probably way more analytical than a lot of folks when they hear that. It's gonna be like, yeah, that's just like, but it's not blindly following an AI. It's having an AI help lead a process so that you come to good outcomes. And the reality is that we can take meandering paths, and eventually, if we never quit and keep evolving and iterating, like we'll get to a good outcome. I mean, you don't lose if you don't quit. Eventually, you'll get there. But I'd rather take a straight path and not take 18 months or 18 years to get there.
Right. So let's dive into the strategy stuff here. Do you want to dive into and sort of try to explain Department OS and what this is, or do you feel like it's too early to try to break it down? I feel like we could go into it at least high level what we're thinking.
Sure. Well, yeah, at a high level, we want to bring AI into our operations. We want to build agents and what we're calling AI first operations. And so we're thinking through the process of how do you get there, and starting at the very top of the process, right? You got to have all your core documents as we think about it. We are well versed in EOS, Entrepreneur Operating System, so using that as at least those concepts. We don't necessarily use it per se, but use those those concepts which it didn't originate. It just put terminology on it, which is like what's the mission, vision, values, all those core documents, and there's probably 30 or 40 different core documents that EOS would advocate that you have. So starting there, and if you're going to do that with an agent, well, that's an onboarding agent. It's like, okay, well, let's make sure you've aggregated all this stuff, all these core core concepts, and they're documented. Now your strategy agent has that to work with, right? It's not, because if not, the AI will have lots of ideas for you, but it may not be rooted in the truths that you've already established. And then your strategy agent helps you flesh out strategy, as we've already been articulating, and it has sub agents, which are critiquing agents. And the goal there is just to have really thoughtful strategy. And the how we framed it internally here is that you should have 5 times the depth, and ideally at 5 times the speed, which means 4 years ago we would have had strategy documents that we would create, and every quarter, every year we would go through a process and build these things. And maybe it takes a couple of weeks to build your annual goals and strategies that you're going to implement. Well, maybe you can do that in a matter of a day or two, and it can be a lot more in depth than you would have had. And then that's just the starting point. That's getting to the starting line of the marathon, and then from there you have to execute. So I'll land it there to say, bringing AI into business, it's like, okay, well, how about we get a foundation to our strategy, and then we can get into execution.
Right. Get the core documents. And this is in many ways focused on the management layer, which I know you talked about on our first episode. But like some of the agents we've at least now decided to put into what this is, this department OS, we've got, planning, strategy, a meeting agent. I think that's important. Because it has to have the context of what you're talking about, meetings, messaging in Slack or ClickUp about what you're talking about, and decisions that were made. Something really cool is that the meeting agent can write to a decision log of things you've decided to do, and then you have another sort of strategy agent that you can go to and just like, look, we're not on a meeting right now, but I'm working through this, and I think we should change that decision and do this instead.
Right. Can we double click for a second on the meeting agent to say, it's a proxy for aggregating decisions. Let's say, you could have an organization that just doesn't have meetings, and then it's like, okay, well, which would be fine as long as you're aggregating, the many different ideas and discussions that are being had into a pipeline of these are the decisions that are being made. And using a meeting is a pretty typical way of doing that. Meetings can be lots of things, but in my belief, a good meeting is used to make decisions and flesh out discussions where you need stakeholders there to get together and efficiently make decisions and document those things. So I think we're using the meeting agent as the single funnel of decisions to make its way back to the planning agent, right? And then you have where historically you would have a human that's your maybe your sprint manager and leading planning, and you're still going to have a human doing it, but you might as well have an AI that's planning. And so that meeting agent again is that kind of represents the funneling of all of those discussions and decisions that are made, so that there's a single point that flows into planning.
Right. So you might even advocate for renaming the meeting agent to a communication agent.
Yeah. Well, it's I'm open-mindedness is a core value, so sure, yeah, I will be open-minded to the idea.
Yeah, context for the audience is that I was super confused with all the different agents that were being built, and agents we were building to help us build agents, but that agent was also a part of the agent that we were building. And at one point I started calling the meeting agent the communication agent because I was thinking of it as something totally else from what it was. And Luke,
but it is,
and you're getting it mixed up. But now it's just been a running joke of maybe we should rename this agent.
But I mean, as I was just describing, the meeting agent really is just a proxy for all of your communication funneling into a single point that flows into our planning agent, right? So if you didn't have a meeting agent, then maybe you would need this maybe a communication agent that has to then distill the many different conversations you're having. Maybe they're email threads, maybe they're recordings of calls, maybe they're Slack channels. That has to get aggregated somewhere to distill it down to these are the decisions that were ultimately made. And our approach was to use that meeting agent to try to simplify what could be many different communication flows.
Yeah. Well, one of the agents in here that I really like is the document screening agent, and I'm biased because I sort of drafted this up originally and pushed for it. And the idea of like managers get so many different sort of memos or updates, proposals for like a pivot on the project, or hey, we want to change the project scope. And it takes a lot of mental calories, takes a lot of context switching, because every different doc you're going to get in a different template. They're not standardized often. And a lot of cognitive cycles to go through and analyze and figure out, is this the right decision to do this pivot or increase this scope? And so there's this strategy document screening agent that acts as a gatekeeper to screen management artifacts to make sure that they're structurally sound, have logical integrity, and aren't making claims that are just factually wrong as well. And we put it through sort of, the logic critique, an external fact checker, a council of sort of believability to make sure, like, hey, like you're talking about, a pivot here in social media or something, but you don't mention any playbook or framework from a person like MrBeast or Alex Hormozi on this. And so there's no reason that we should believe that you're even implementing any best practices. And it'll go through and actually revise and update and pull those playbooks, update the document based off of the logic critique and everything before it actually lands on the manager's desk. So that way the manager, all the documents they're reviewing are standardized to the same sort of level of depth and excellence. And I think that's, especially if you got a company with like more than 40 people, then that one's seems like a big win.
Right. A couple of comments there is, you don't need Alex Hormozi to use his playbooks if, in fact, you have a sales manager who has built a pipeline that sold $100 million for the product, right? In that case, that manager's already believable enough to perhaps, greenfield create his own playbooks. But in the absence of that, it gets back to this kind of Ray Dalio principle around believability. It's like, well, let's make sure we have playbooks that are proven and that we're using those. So yeah, big fan of having the, ideas screened. And then the experience that I've had is, I think probably most people have had, and I'm sure you have as well, Braden. It's like you get people who are working with you, whether they're subordinates or peers, who will have ideas, and maybe it was an AI generated idea, and it was AI slop, and it's a waste of your mental calories, and those things should be screened. And the goal is to kind of one of the overarching goals is to protect our cognitive load, and that's as we bring AI in, it's one of that kind of the overarching goals is to like, I only have so much cognitive load in a day. How do I protect that cognitive load and ensure that AI is a little bit of the defense mechanism to not get things brought to me to review and provide feedback that could have been fleshed out more, thought through more, have already met certain criteria prior to landing on my desk. And it's such a big win, because then when you're looking at documents, you read through it and you're like, this feels right, this feels good, and there's evidence to show how it's already been stress tested. Because if not, things land on your desk and it's like, okay, now what's the unspoken thing is like, now it's my responsibility to either sign off or provide feedback, which maybe that's overtly stated, and if I'm going to do that justice, if I blindly sign off on it, then quite possibly we're going to go down, a path of misadventure that is, going to be flawed. And, 18 months later, we realize we made a wrong turn. And, or I do a really good job and I spend, the next 2 days really fleshing out something. And it's like, well, either A, my system sucked because this should have never made it to my desk, or B, I had the wrong person providing me this because they weren't experienced enough to provide me something that was well thought through. And both can be true. And our goal is to kind of build the system so that it's not that we have to have A plus super. We can't necessarily afford to hire people with Alex Hormozi's experience at every level of marketing. We're going to have junior people oftentimes, not to pick on marketing people, but since we're using Hormozi, we'll kind of focus in sales and marketing. You're going to have, we have junior people, some real experienced, some not. And we need a system that helps account for that. And that's the idea here, is to bring AI alongside of them to force them, or at least steer them down, not force them, to steer them down a path that is really thoughtful and limits the time I have to spend going through and critiquing it, because God knows I'm not going to get it right all the time. And I'm probably going to get it wrong more often than not.
Right. So, got a portfolio of companies. You want to have an AI first operations across them all. What's like some hurdles that happen with getting people to use it? What is the biggest pushback you get from companies that are in your portfolio when you're trying to go in and implement agents beyond the technical, right? You've got people sort of pushing back, or who are afraid, or who don't understand it. What's sort of a big blocker that is preventing agentification as fast as you might otherwise like?
change management, you and I've talked about it a lot, right? Getting people to change habits and process is incredibly difficult, and perhaps the most difficult thing when it comes to, becoming an AI first operation, because you're literally, what that means is, rebuilding all of your systems and processes to incorporate this new alien life form that is AI. And that's going to, have this, whether it's, this intentional or even just unintentional, perhaps, even if it's just somewhat happening, unintentionally by people, they're just not going to bias to let me change things because, they already have mental models and processes in place. So there's that. And then, then there's just education in general, right? If people are not, educated on, what is the opportunity that exists to incorporate AI into their process, then they just have a lack of knowledge. So, how do you build in that education so that people have a fighting chance? And then you have, you're at an organization level, or do you have the right people who share the right core values, like open-mindedness and the idea that you're pursuing excellence, and and that just gets down to having the right team in place. And if you don't have the right team in place, then that's I think almost just fundamentally impossible. And how do you get the right team in place? Well, you got to have really clearly defined core values that align with your goals, and you got to be willing to hire and fire based upon those core values. All things that we aim to do, and we're constantly trying to continue. We've done that for years, kind of screening with core values, but now even bringing AI into the process to making sure that our core values are well known to all humans and all AI, so that we're just constantly trying to stay aligned to it. It's the tuning fork, so to speak.
So if you were going through and doing due diligence on a company that you're potentially looking to acquire, you would sort of be using that same AI system to screen the personnel and either flag that personnel have the right sort of core values that align with the management company, or highlight the fact that these companies don't have a lot of employees that have these core values, and then note that as a red flag for potential replacement further down the road. And I just kind of want to pull on the thread of how much AI is going to impact M&A, as specifically in sort of due diligence and even planning at a portfolio level for what companies to go and acquire.
Well, maybe just pick one lane to respond there. Aligning with core values is very much a human process, but AI can certainly help facilitate it, right? Even if you're, let's say you're doing the initial onboarding of a new employee, you should have a process that helps you identify, do individuals share your core values? And that might be open-ended questions. One that we've used, for example, is, one of our core values is this idea of, kind of taking ownership of what you do, made kind of popular through like Jocko, who's the Navy SEAL who wrote the book Extreme Ownership. That concept, you want team members, we do at least, that take ownership of what they do. And it's, they're not finger pointing. If something doesn't go right, their instinct is to say, what could I have done better to achieve the outcome, not the instinct of pointing fingers. So, in a screening, interview, you might, bring up a conversation around, talking about a project that didn't go well. And, firstly, if you can't get someone to even bring up a conversation around something that didn't go well, then, that's a big red flag right there, because clearly things have not gone well at some point in time in someone's career, that or they're just completely inexperienced, which would be, you just need to be eyes wide open that, I have someone who literally, this is, day one in their professional career. But if they have, and you can get into that conversation, it's, can be, fairly straightforward to identify how much ownership do they take in that conversation, because people already have their biases for how they will recount stories. And, if you come out and just say, do you take ownership over situations, people understand what the right answer is. But if you can get them to tell the story and they're doing the majority of the talking, and you're just leading them into the conversation of talk me through the situation, you can generally tease this out. And, AI can help you prepare for that conversation. AI can help you, even you can have these tools that, AI can be right there listening into the conversation and even help prompt you to, hey, let's double click on that. Let's drill down into that. And understand it further. And again, AI is helping the interviewer steer the conversation to really tease these things out. And at the end of the day, like, you just want to know, is this person going to share my core values? In this example around ownership, and if they don't, man, figure that out prior to hiring, because if you hire the wrong person, it's a cautionary tale of all the things that will go wrong when you have someone who ultimately is almost poisonous to your organization because they're pointing fingers and not taking ownership. And I'm a big fan of team mentality. I came up playing team sports, and man, nothing worse than having people who have their own ego and they're worried about the how they look versus the outcomes of in sports is the outcome of the game. Did you win, right? If you're on a basketball team, it's like, oh, you scored 50 points but your team lost. We don't really care about your 50 points, we care about the loss.
Right. Yeah, hire slowly and fire quickly is a little ism that I've heard from a lot of folks onto this.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's this kind of axiom around when you realize you've made a mistake, when is the time to correct it, and that's like immediately, not letting it play out and trying to mitigate the problem. And easier said than done, because oftentimes in an organization it's like, well, we don't know what we'll do tomorrow if this person's not here, and usually those beliefs are a little bit overstated in our mind. It's pretty rare that the organization falls apart without a single person.
Right. I've heard lots of people think it's quite dystopian to use AI in recruiting and screening and in HR after you've hired people. But I think that doesn't even make sense, because the concern would be that without AI, you have all of these sort of biases or prejudices that are maybe subconscious or aren't documented somewhere. But the moment you move this into an AI system, if you're going to have a prejudice or a preference, which aren't necessarily bad things to have whenever you're screening to hire people, those things are documented. And so it's not as though it's going to be like this unverifiable thing, whether or not, this person had a preference in their hiring process. It's all there to be documented.
Right.
And it's all going to be verified. And it's a lot easier to subpoena Fortune 500's, context documentation on their hiring preferences than it is to, tease it out of someone's mind who's head of hiring.
Well, a couple of comments is, lots of people who might say that, and maybe it is dystopian, but, their beliefs around AI may be just different than ours, and maybe even their use of AI is minimal, and they're not using it, well. And, when it comes to, say, HR, I would, as you just pointed out, there's, a couple of great uses for AI. One is helping you keep it objective, right, and help tease out subjective biases, as well as helping carry the cognitive load. Back to this, like if you're trying to, identify core values in someone, there's a lot of cognitive load that goes into that, and AI can help, the interviewer or the company tease these things out and identify these things. And so AI is the helper, and then also core to our belief around the use of AI is having the proper stage gates around where the human in the loop is. And so making sure that the human ultimately is making, decisions, not AI making decisions, and making sure that you have that organized in a way that, the AI literally brings it back to the human, saying, okay, this is what we've gathered. This is my objective analysis. And, and then bringing it back to the human, and the human has to be qualified enough that they are a believable person to be able to push back on the AI, right? Which is the other big fatal flaw that we can see too often, is where you have someone who gets ideas from an AI, yet they're not experienced enough to actually identify where the AI is misaligned with the thinking, because AI sounds really smart, and part of our human bias is to believe things that sound smart, but you have to be able to tease out to say, well, hold on a second. This, and this is not right. Feed it back to the AI. And, what I love about AI is it's, generally unemotional, and it will say, oh, okay. And sometimes the AI will push back and be like, okay, Lucas, yeah, you say that, but here's how I see it, which is great. And that gets back to having good prompting in your AI to make sure it's not a suffocant where it's just going to agree with everything you say. And you try to tease it out to get to a root truth. And either there's some thoughts around good use of AI, and most of the naysayers around AI, I think, just generally don't use it well.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I first, thought about AI and the impact in Fortune 500 companies and private equity, and lots of folks, said this, it wasn't just my initial thought, that AI would be able to lead to laying off mass percentages of your workforce, and you could still maintain and do the same amount of work. And then sort of, you and I have talked about in the last week's podcast how, that isn't necessarily quite the case. Oftentimes, like we have more radiologists, not less. In your, instance, you can see that people are doing more. And so why not actually hire more people? Because now these people are able to do even more, But for companies like, take Mag 7 companies, for example, what are these folks going to do more of that they haven't already been able to do? And they're potentially going to run into sort of antitrust if they try to, scale and move into markets that are, they previously weren't in. And so I think maybe we'll see small businesses being able to scale a lot more and do things they weren't able to do. But a lot of these Fortune 500 companies are potentially, at least someone like Jay Cal would say it's already happening, are just going to be leaning towards the route of getting lean and laying off. What do you think of that? I mean, it's a little bit of crystal ball, but there are sort of two thoughts here. One is your employees are now more enhanced with AI, so you could keep your employee headcount the same, maybe even increase it. And then the other one is, hey, look, my employees are more powerful now with AI. I don't need as many employees, and so I can decrease my OpEx, protect my bottom line. So there's three camps there. Employees count could stay the same, increase, or you could go cut costs like a sort of traditional private equity firm would do. And I think all of these are justifiable with AI. I mean, they all sort of make sense in just pure math, trying to increase EBITDA and enterprise value. What are your thoughts on those in the economy and where they take place most prevalently?
Well, first let me suggest that having fun and doing. I love adventure and having fun, and so business needs to incorporate some of that. And so if you're let's say, but you get down to brass tacks, it's not always fun and an adventure. Over the holidays, I listened to a little bit of a kind of biographical background on Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of J.P. Morgan, and the man was very effective at recalibrating businesses that were not healthy, and which was a really interesting story to hear. And I mentioned that to say, like, the natural ebb and flow of a business should be you grow, you contract, become healthier, you get leaner and focus on your core competencies, and then you grow again. And so I think that is the natural evolution of a business. That's the healthy evolution of a business. If you never have, periods of time, for most, there's always the exception, but most businesses do go through these cycles of growth and contraction, and that's healthy and that's good. I think most people, people who are experts in business would agree with that. And so AI is just going to help you do that better, perhaps, and perhaps allow you to do it more quickly. So, maybe you had 30,000 engineers if you're Google, and maybe you can reduce that down to 15,000 engineers because you became more lean. Great. Well, that's the natural, evolution of business. You referred to Jevons paradox before, this idea that, there's more radiologists. It's like, okay, well, a hospital, now that you can do more, you can handle more patients because you can have AI help read things more quickly. You ultimately need more radiologists. And so there's a time to grow it, but there's also a time to contract. And so, sure, like, will there'll be layoffs? Yes. Jevons paradox would suggest that ultimately it results in growth because the innovation led to more opportunities. I guess I don't think it changes the fundamental, the fundamental focus and strategies that businesses should be employing. You should grow, contract, recalibrate strategy, continue to grow. And that looks different for every business.
Got it. No, that's good. I think having a counter argument to sort of the dystopian here is useful, and I think a lot of this hasn't been conveyed to the mass public around AI and the benefits of AI. I think even David Sachs has talked about this, about how folks in the AI space need to be doing a better job conveying how it allows for these sort of benefits, and not just like, look, AI is so great, it can do what people do. We're going to replace people with it. Isn't this awesome? Now your electricity bill is going to go up. And there certainly are folks who talk positively about it and the impacts of it, on Twitter and across various podcasts. But it's not the predominant narrative across the media, and it's sad to see, because I spend a lot of time in AI and I enjoy working with AI, and bringing that up with sort of folks who aren't in that AI space. It's just always a shock to see how they view it, how they think about it, and how evil they've assumed that the technology is, even though they haven't necessarily dived into it and tried to understand the benefits.
Sure. Well, and no doubt is it going to create these, kind of secondary and tertiary problems, so to speak, and those things have to be addressed. And so, I think it'd be foolish to think that we're going to, evolve and implement AI through all of the economy and through businesses and not create new problems that have to be addressed. But I think it is a little bit short-sighted for folks to kind of think that today's environment will be, there's a lot of thinking out there. It's like, okay, we're going to create this problem, and now that just is the problem, and this is this new reality. It's like, no, we as humans, at least in a capitalistic society, we solve those problems. And, might there be, a role for government and other, organizations to help solve these problems? Perhaps, hopefully more in the short term. I'm definitely more of a capitalist at heart and don't want to see government too involved in things, but, not opposed to having backup plans. But, as I've expressed before, I am ruthlessly opposed to government intervening, solving problems before they happen, because there's just, from a principled position, I'm not a big believer that humans predict the future very well. And to solve a problem before it happens is rooted in this premise that we are predicting the future, and we have the solution for that problem. And that problem's not actually happened yet, but we're going to create, say, regulation and rules to solve problems that haven't happened yet. That is a cautionary tale. I think that has really at the root of a lot of socialistic and even communistic thinking, that we can identify the future problems and we can put solutions in place. It's antithetical to capitalism, and I am very cautious of folks who have that way of thinking. Generally, I don't think that if it was framed that way, they'd be like, oh no, I'm not trying to take the socialistic approach. It's like, well, you are if you're suggesting regulation based upon a predicted problem that hasn't happened yet. That's a core of a socialistic mindset.
What if the problems happened in another country? You see in China, self-driving cars are taking away jobs, and the Chinese government has come in and set a rate in the economy for how many of like rideshare services, like their Uber equivalent and whatnot, can be replaced and autonomized, taken over by an AI per year. And would you be in favor of something like that happening in the U.S., where there's a rate, X amount of cars that are autonomous can be put onto the road per year, and no more than X people can be replaced or let off in a year? So that way there's a slow sort of process where those people have to leave and go get a new job in the economy versus it happening all at once. Because in our economy, we would be predicting it, but looking at the world economy, you can make the argument that, look, we're seeing it in China, and so we could pre-fire it here in the States. What would be your thought on it?
My thought, and it's above my pay grade, is my real thought, and I'm trying to solve problems inside of small business operations and not trying to solve federal government problems. But if I'm just going to take a principled approach to it, I would kind of stick with those comments from before, that I'm not going to advocate that we solve problems based upon our crystal ball in the future. At the same time, I'm a big fan of the idea of having a backup plans and contingency plans And so should you have, mass layoffs in a particular sector, how do you address that from a federal government standpoint? I would hope they have plans for that, and I would hope those plans, are not kind of antithetical to capitalism and the free market, and instead we solve problems. We let capitalism solve problems, and if we need safety nets for sectors of the economy, by all means, let's retool people, let's re-educate people, let's make sure people aren't falling into poverty, let's make sure children have education and the things that they need, and let people go through somewhat of the natural struggle that is life, to build up the skills to add value to society. But that's just one of these things. Like, not that many people are going to be hearing my opinion on the matter, but I'm just cautious because, again, no doubt there will be problems that come out of it, and it can feel very feel as if you have no empathy for folks to suggest that these things need to resolve themselves. But it does seem to be a clear history of if we're going to preemptively solve problems, they generally don't. There's worse secondary and tertiary outcomes than if we let the
Free market.
capitalistic free market solve these problems.
Right. No, that's good. Well, good conversation. Let's potentially bring this to a wrap and explain what you're going to be working on over the next 3-4 days. Go as detailed as you'd like. I know you're in the middle of a prompting conversation when we hopped on the call. So what did you work on this morning? What do you want to work on over the next 3-4 days? What do you have to do that you don't really want to do over the next 3-4 days?
Well, what I am working on is, here we are, January 3rd. So, a lot of planning for the new year, a lot of working on what our goals are for the year, what our strategies are for the year, trying to set up AIs that will help our team members, our portfolio ventures, bring AI into these conversations. Right now, historically, these would be human exclusive type of processes, and maybe they're having some conversations with AI in the process, which is almost can be dangerous in itself, as I said before, because people can just say, "Oh, that sounds smart," but instead, how do we put some infrastructure around the process? Is really what I'm working on. This idea of making sure that they have infrastructure around it. Again, not to repeat kind of what was said before around strategy agents and critiquing agents and planning agents, but bringing them into the process. But then one of the outcomes from that is then AI can be in sync along with the process. So as they go through the execution, they have an AI that's well informed, that actually was part of the iterative process of developing the strategies, and can also be part of the iterative process of executing. And so I view my goal as kind of building that infrastructure. And then I'm a big fan of our team members owning outcomes. And so I'm not going to get in and micromanage that process. Instead, I'm just going to help build that infrastructure so that they can then be responsible for the delivering of those goals. And so that's where I'm at right now, and that's what I'm what I want to be working on, what I am working on. Outside of this, I have other things that need my attention in Q1. We have new ventures we're working on. There's financing and budgets and vendor partner relationships, and many of those things that will require my attention. All the more reason why I want to have some peace of mind to know that there's good systems and process that are supporting our team, and it's not people out there left with just ambitious goals and feeling like they're floundering, but instead they have good infrastructure, good AI infrastructure to help them execute.
All right, so now I want you to basically describe what I should be working on the next 3-4 days and break down what I'm working on, actually. So that way on episode 24, it'll be like 6 months from now, we can go look back and see how much it changed, or see how well or poorly I did it. How does that sound?
Right. So, as a new team member to our organization, and we've positioned you in this role of being the non-engineer involved in our agent deployment. And so, while I'm working with you and helping lead the strategy and kind of the vision for what we're doing, a lot of this, I need to be able to hand off to you so that you can help with the continued execution of it. And that is a lot of that is this agent infrastructure, and it's quite the undertaking, and you really have to be able to not be focused on other things. It's hard to context switch and then come back and dive really deep in what can be, have some levels of complexity, mainly just because there's lots of layers of, if you're rebuilding all your systems and processes to incorporate AI, there's a lot of cognitive load there. So you are helping lead that process from a non-engineer standpoint. Right now we do have some pilots with some engineers. We do expect that we'll be handing those off to an engineering team, and so you'll be leading the non-engineering side of this, so that the engineers are building they're building what we've envisioned, and we're kind of dog fooding it along the way. So your key role is going to be kind of helping the non-engineers dog food the process and making sure that what they're dog fooding isn't their own their own version, right? They're out there saying, hey, this is how I'm bringing AI into my management process. And it's like, no, we have infrastructure, we have process that we're building, we're piloting, and we've envisioned, and making sure that we're accelerating through that. And the only way you accelerate through it is to really do it and to dog food it, so to speak, so that we actually can be iteratively improving it, right? We can't be building this in a silo, right? We need multiple teams inside of our portfolio to be utilizing these processes, to be incorporating and using AI as we're envisioning, to be using these agents as we're describing. And so what does that look like? Well, I think there's a lot of unknowns that we'll only know once we go through it, and that is the kind of what is the non-technical person's role look like, and what does it mean to manage agents, for example? What does it mean to build education around managing agents? What does it look like to build the education around the use of these agents? All of that we're building, and you're leading that. And so at the same time, we're building it and then expecting you to lead it. And if I didn't have a lot of confidence in you, I wouldn't be putting you in that role. But I feel like it's well suited for with your skills, and so that's my vision for your role. How do you feel about that?
No, it feels good. Come back 6 months, look at it, see how I did, and because there has been conversation, I think, around what it is to sprint versus marathon, and so I think in 6 months we'll know if the sprint is done, or if we did so good that it makes sense to continue running a marathon. But I mean, this is a core muscle for a management company to be able to implement across their portfolio, future companies to acquire or to do roll-ups, is have a really, really great world-class process. I mean, this would essentially be the product of many private equity firms over the next 5 to 10 years. I think is like a core product to be able to agentify teams. Go roll up 18 different e-commerce businesses or recruiting businesses, and be able to agentify them. I think is going to be a core competency. So hopefully I can accelerate that core competency. Well, we'll see here in 20 episodes where I'm at.
Yeah, we will.
All right, so good stuff. Wonderful pod. We'll see you all next week again, and we'll talk more about AI and why it's not going to kill everyone. Hopefully. Have a good rest.
Yeah, hopefully. All right.
Have a good rest of your weekend.
All right. Thanks, Greg. Chat later.